went into adventure novels, and then straight to the American Mark Twain. Further on, discovered Balzac, Dostoevsky, and Hemingway. Years had passed by reading. I lived only in reading. My emotions and adventures were literary. I trusted the paper more than my personal experience. I identified with almost every other character in those novels. Life in books seemed to me more real than the so-called real life. I earned money for my first camera because I was photography, an amateur photographer. Working as a caddy for Americans on the golf course, I got 50 pfennigs per round and a Coca-Cola, enough to buy an Agfa box. Rudolf Lind, the local spa photographer, first engaged me for the afternoons in his shop, then in his darkroom, and finally as an assistant carrying his tripod. Early in the morning I went out to catch the rising sun in the mist, or else willows over a pond in the moonlight, and felt very creative. My artistic education was shaped by illustrated magazines in the waiting room of my father's surgery. Although culture was prized by society, in daily life it was limited to the request hour on the radio and a few quotations from Faust. My father divided art into two categories, the pleasant and the unpleasant. Since in life he had experienced enough of the latter, art had provided him with the former, the pleasant. He tried to prevent me, resorting to intrigue, from making my first film based on Robert Musil's Young Turles, and held the tin drum in a word for dreadful. I first rebelled against this father by sneaking off from after school to the Roxy, the Rio, the Apollo, or the Valhalla, the popular cinemas in Wiesbaden, to watch westerns and detective stories, later called film noir. They appealed to me and my friends because they were regarded as filth and trash. And besides, these movies came from America, which made it worse for the adults, but all the more attractive for us. Film became an ever greater part of my life. In Schloss Biebrich, next to my father's medical practice, was the German Film Industry Volunteer Self-Censorship Commission, Freiwillige Film-Selbstkontrolle, FSK. A very German institution, however, created by the Allies after the war to prevent Nazi content in post-war films. In the mid-50s, however, this commission classified films less on political grounds and more on the content of sex and violence, in keeping with the norms of the times. A former classmate of my older brother, Georg, worked there as projectionist, and by climbing a small iron ladder I was able to enter the projection booth. Every afternoon after class I watched films caught between the two rattling projectors in the heat of their arc lights. I don't remember many of the films. Blackboard Jungle was one of them, and Barefoot Contessa another. But certainly I remember the 35mm celluloid strips of film from which Franz, the projectionist, had to cut out the objectionable scenes, the trimmings on the cutting room floor, and the beguiling smell of acetone glue. For the first time, film was not just light, shadows, and movement on a screen, but something tangible. I pestered my father until he agreed to come with me to the small film studio in town to inquire about the training of a cameraman, because that is what I wanted to become, and the career possibilities in this industry. Unfortunately, on the way to the office, we didn't meet Romy Schneider, who was then at age 16 shooting her first film in Wiesbaden. The head of the studio explained that a cameraman's apprenticeship consisted mostly of learning by doing, and concluded in his strong Hessian accent, "Ach, Herr Doktor, don't make the boy unhappy. Have him learn a decent trade." Behind Wiesbaden's America House, I discovered the Pestalozzi Club, which organized 3-month sojourns in France for the purpose of learning the language. This was exactly what my father wished for, I thought. And when he saw that the boarding school's fees were quite reasonable, he agreed to let me go. An 18-hour train raid, quite with a changeover in Paris, quite difficult from Gare de l'Est to Gare de Montparnasse, brought me to the far end of France, Finistère. At the station, I was met by a priest in a black soutane and a flat Roman hat. It was a Jesuit boarding school that me, the Protestant, had picked. Next morning, one of the boys took me to the floor where the priests had their cells. We had to take off our shoes to walk on the shining polish of the corridor. The priests, coming the other way and meeting us, were gliding along on square pieces of felt, like dead serious skaters. I was introduced to Picasso, as Father Arnaud de Solage was known. He received me with a smile and reminded me of the famous painter, less in resemblance, but more in spirit. Picasso, as we called him, spoke good German. Also, he was the school's German teacher. I would learn French from him. I didn't speak a word when I got there. Since he was also in charge of the theater team, Équipe de Théâtre, he assigned me to this group. So the very same afternoon, I was at theater rehearsal, had to learn the line of a very, very small part, and I used this line whenever I could, whether on purpose or not. Next to the theater, Picasso also ran the film club, and that's where I saw my first silent film, Dreyer's Jeanne d'Arc. Tears welling up, Picasso explained how strong one's faith could be when it gives us the courage to die by fire and never curse man or God. The Ninth Day is my belated tribute to him, and not only because of the black and white photography. A master-student relationship grew out of the many afternoons I spent in Picasso's cell and led to a friendship spanning over 30 years. When he died, I had the honor of being a pallbearer carrying the coffin down into the Jesuit vault in Tours along with other fellow monks. One day, all of us students were allowed to go to the cinema in town to see a film by one of the former students of the school, Alain Resnais, who was born in Vannes, Morbihan. That film was Nuit et Brouillard, Night and Fog, 1957. Of course, I had heard in Germany about the camps, mostly through jokes about the use of gas in the making of glue from bones, by the way. I cannot recall a genuine description of the Holocaust and its images or statistics from our history lessons in the gymnasium in Wiesbaden. And as such, I was neither mentally nor physically prepared for the horror of the images that unfolded before me. It's hard to imagine the impact of Night and Fog today. In the 50s, these images were unbearable. Nowadays, they are exploited at random in undignified ways, I think, even in feature films. But then, as the lights went up in the auditorium, and I, so German boy among 100 French kids, who I thought all looked at me, found it extremely hard to get up. I still see my friends and their silent faces and how they asked me the same question which half a century later we are still asking ourselves. How was it possible? I was forced to adopt a view, a point of view, a position, and not to collapse in contriteness and guilt whenever this topic was raised. Deep down, I have never overcome the experience of that morning in Vannes. And most of my films, beginning with Young Turles and ending up with The Ninth Day, still seek an answer to the question unleashed by that screening. On the other hand, I felt so much at ease in the new surroundings in France that I wanted to stay. Maybe I just didn't want to be a German anymore. I managed to convince my father that I could just as well finish my schooling here and obtaining the baccalaureate instead of the Abitur, if he let me do so. And so, instead of 3 months, as planned, I did stay, in fact, 10 years in France. The Americanized boy was to get a new identity. He was trying hard to assimilate and to become a Frenchman. My teachers were like sport coaches and pushing me to perform. I was sent to Paris to compete among all the best students from France in the Concours Général, where actually I won the Prix de Philosophie. A few weeks later, right in the middle of class, I was summoned by the schoolmaster and asked to report to the usually invisible